It's not always what you hear from Donald Trump.
I call upon all of us to set aside our differences, to seek out common ground, and to summon the unity we need to deliver for the people. This is really the key. These are the people we were elected to serve.
The tone conciliatory in his State of the Union address. Let's look now, though, at the message. Donald Trump's overture came before a Congress where the big battle that now awaits is on immigration. By insisting on a wall with Mexico, the U.S. president has tied upcoming budget negotiations to how a nation built by immigrants sees its future. Will the nativist core of his electorate drive the agenda on selected immigration, curbs unwelcoming family members of migrants, and closing the border on more than people, but also on some free trade arrangements? What does 2018 have in store? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at a speech, a State of the Union speech that was a case of, well, good Trump, bad Trump. And with us from Washington to talk about it, Josh Kraushaar, politics editor at the National Journal. How are you?
Good to be here.
Good to have you. Good as well to welcome Chris Chemerinsky of the anti-immigration advocacy group Numbers USA. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
From New Haven, Connecticut, Miranda Yaver, who teaches at Yale University. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Ruth Ben-Artzi, visiting fellow at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Donald Trump leaving the door open on a deal for dreamers in that big speech of his. And he struck this conciliatory tone, though, through many parts. Let me begin with you, Josh Kraushaar, before we go into the specifics of it, and just talk about that tone, because the way that foreign correspondents for the French media were reporting it this morning, it was a new Trump that they'd heard. Was it a new Trump for you?
Well, he outlined this policy about a week ago, saying he's trying to offer a carrot to the dreamers, the children of illegal immigrants who have been in the United States for many years. But as a compromise, he's looking for Democrats to accept some curbs on both illegal and legal immigration. On the illegal side, he's trying to step up enforcement and construct a border wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. And on the legal side, President Trump wants to curb the number of family members that can come, to the United States that are related to an immigrant. So he's allowing, direct family, children, husbands, and wives, but he wants to reduce the number of extended family members that can come legally if you have an immigrant that comes into the country. So this is a compromise that gives the Democrats a lot of what they want. And when it comes to these dreamers, the children of illegal immigrants that have been such a big political football over the last few years, but it also is asking for some changes to the American immigration system that had been in place for almost 5 decades.
And Josh, before we go into the specifics, what did you think listening to him? This was, reading this was the longest State of the Union address since Bill Clinton's days, 80 minutes long. What did you think while listening to it?
There were parts of every type of Trump personality that we've seen over the last year. It was certainly a more conciliatory address. He stuck to the teleprompter. It was a pretty traditional Republican speech, aside from a little dose of nativism that you wouldn't have heard from past Republican presidents. A lot of the policy proposals, the talk about the economy, the talk about human rights in North Korea, these are issues that President Bush, President Reagan would have talked about in past States of the Union. So this was a very establishment, traditional State of the Union, perhaps with a little dose of nativism, a little more to the right on immigration, but everything else was pretty mainstream.
Everything else was pretty mainstream. You mentioned the Trump leaving the door open for that deal on the Dreamers. It was on his terms, though. He talked of citizenship for 1.8 million undocumented workers, but they need to meet education standards, work requirements, and show good moral character over a 12-year period.
So tonight I am extending an open hand to work with members of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, to protect our citizens of every background, color, religion, and creed. My duty, and the sacred duty of every elected official in this chamber, is to defend Americans, to protect their safety, their families, their communities, and their right to the American dream. Because Americans are dreamers too.
Miranda Yaver, Americans are dreamers too. What do you make of that statement?
Sort of an all lives matter take on immigration. I think it's important to remember that President Trump was the one who put dreamers at risk in the first place. I agree with Josh's assessment of the State of the Union. It was pretty mainstream. We've certainly seen President Trump give teleprompter speeches and then, within a matter of hours go on Twitter and reverse a lot of the scripted remarks that he said. But it's important to remember that President Trump was the one who looked to end DACA, to put these people at risk. And he knows that by sort of pigeonholing Democrats into ending what he refers to as chain migration and accepting merit-based immigration and giving in with border wall money, this is going to be a tough way for Democrats to protect dreamers. And it's also a really odd thing that we're continuing to fight over DACA, because this is something that's immensely popular. There was a recent CBS poll that showed that 70% of Americans support DACA, support allowing these dreamers to stay in the United States. These are people who are students, who are doctors, who are firefighters, who are teachers. These are the kinds of people who make America great. And by instituting this merit-based immigration system, putting existing dreamers at risk and then making it harder for other people to come, it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding or an ignorance about this American dream that we claim to embrace, which is that people should be able to come here and work their way up. Frankly, if we're going to adopt a merit-based immigration system, I'd like to have a merit-based presidency first.
Chris Chmielewski, 70% says Miranda Yaver, according to that survey, who favor making the dreamers have their status become permanent in the United States. Are you one of those 70%?
Well, there's no doubt that the population, the dreamer population, they have a compelling case, and an argument can be made for them, for some of them to be able to stay here. But and we've seen through polling that those positions, support for them staying is popular. But there's also, some of the things that President Trump talked about last night: ending chain migration, ending visa lottery, stepping up both border and interior enforcement. Those things are popular amongst the American people too. Just last week, there was a poll conducted by Harvard-Harris that found that 70% of Americans, 60% of Americans would also agree with a DACA proposal that ended chain migration and the visa lottery and border security. So there is popular support amongst Americans to do that. There is a tradition of immigration in the United States, but what a lot of Americans don't realize is that the average annual inflow of legal immigration per year between 1820, when immigration numbers were first measured, all the way until 1990, only averaged about 325,000. Now, since the Immigration Act of 1990 passed, immigration levels have been over 1 million per year. And all this president is trying to do is put forth some of the recommendations that were made by the last bipartisan immigration commission, chaired by Barbara Jordan back in 1996, that recommended ending chain migration in the visa lottery. And those policies are good for American workers and their wages.
Donald Trump talking about the end of what's called catch and release. Also, like you say, talking about ending the visa lottery and this merit-based immigration system with the accent on skilled workers. Is that really the way forward?
It's one approach. That's not one that I've necessarily pushed for or advocated for, or Numbers USA has advocated for. We support bringing in extraordinarily talented people. We think that that is in the national interest, to bring in folks who can help, discover new things. But at the same time, our immigration policy also has to put the interests of American workers and their wages first. So we have to make sure that the folks that we're bringing in are not competing directly for jobs with American workers, and they're not putting downward pressure on their wages. And we see that through mass immigration and through illegal immigration, for that matter. So whatever reforms are made, I think the top priority has to keep American workers as the priority. Any system has to benefit American workers.
Ruth Ben-Artzi, your thoughts, especially because here in France, there's also this talk of bringing in skilled workers, and in neighboring Germany, the same thing, the idea of only letting skilled workers in.
Right. So I think that we have a few different issues here that need to be unpacked. I think there's a difference between skilled workers that are earmarked for certain professions or for certain sectors of the economy. And there's also the difference, there's the immigration that is based on lottery, or what they call chain migration, that I kind of want to spend.
Yeah, lottery is basically what there's a lot of people who from one country, and they pick out of a hat who gets to apply for a green card.
Right, but that's actually a little bit even simplifying it.
Right.
I recently went through the immigration process to the United States, and after having come into the United States on a student visa, and then marrying an American citizen, being on a green card, and recently in June becoming an American citizen. It is not easy to immigrate to the United States. First of all, it costs money. Second of all, it's paperwork and bureaucracy and interviews. So a lot of this rhetoric makes it seem as if, people just can bring in their family members. If I wanted to bring my parents, my extended family, at this point, it would be very difficult, even without the changing of the law. So I want to make it clear that that even the legal immigration as it exists now, with a lottery and with a chain migration, as it's called, is not at all simple, and it does allow for those kinds of checks and balances that vet immigrants to the United States. I think the rhetoric that is coming from the president and from the Republican Party and from those who oppose or are trying to shrink the legal immigration to the United States is laced with what I see as xenophobia and trying to curtail that kind of immigration. It's not competing, I believe, with American jobs. I see my students in college. I think that when they're not finding jobs, it's not because immigrants are taking their jobs. It's because they're not finding jobs, because sometimes the job, or because they are more picky about jobs, or because they're the sectors that they're trying to enter are sectors that are very competitive, where there's no jobs. They're not competing, not with DACA recipients and not with illegal immigration.
Well, let me ask you, Miranda Yaver, I'll put it to you straight. Do immigrants take away jobs from Americans?
I would say no. I think that that assessment that was just made is right. I mean, we see that, I think that the argument that immigrants are taking jobs is one that's rooted much more in xenophobia than it is in fact. Outsourcing and technology seem to be replacing more human workers. But also, we see doctors taking also a lot of jobs that Americans don't necessarily want. We don't necessarily see, Yale students lining up to be farmers. We see DACA recipients, we see immigrants more broadly in a wide variety of sectors, some of which are low skilled, and we need people who are not necessarily seeking to get engineering degrees because we have a large service economy, for example. And we shouldn't necessarily be saying, well, you need to be a Nobel Prize recipient or a PhD in order to be valuable in this country. And so I think that it would be a misstatement. And it's also important to think about things like doctors and teachers, people who are being put at risk when we endanger immigrants, because when we see the number of students who are affected when they lose a teacher, when we see the number of patients who are affected when we lose doctors. This is also a large number of Americans who are adversely affected by the loss of immigrants.
A recent survey by Pew shows a large majority favor granting permanent legal status to Dreamers, 74%, while 60% opposed to substantially expanding that border wall with Mexico. And there you see, in fact, with the border wall question, you can see how the numbers are even more partisan. It's a very partisan divide. First of all, let me ask you, Chris Chimnensky, this border wall, this huge spending project to reinforce the border with Mexico, is it a good thing?
It can be. I don't think we necessarily need a border wall across all 2,000 miles of the southern border. I think there are some heavily populated areas along the southern border that are vulnerable, so we need some improved barriers placed there, whether it be a wall or double-layered fencing. Let's keep in mind that Congress passed back in 2006 the Secure Fence Act that Democrats and Republicans all voted for and was signed into law, and that required 700 miles of double-layered fencing across the southern border, and that identified areas that are more heavily trafficked. Certainly we don't need fencing in very mountainous and rural areas, but I don't think that building a wall alone is going to eliminate the problem that we have with illegal immigration. I think you need to take away the jobs magnet, and you can only do that by requiring employers to use E-Verify. 40% of illegal aliens currently living in the United States came here legally in the first place and simply overstayed their visa. If folks can come to the country and illegally find ways to work, and we don't cut off that jobs magnet, then they're going to continue to find a way to get here as long as they can find jobs.
But you heard Miranda saying that they don't take away jobs from U.S. citizens.
Right, and I didn't say they took away jobs from U.S. citizens either. I said they compete with Americans for open jobs. But again, the reason why we're in this position in the first place and we're having this debate about DACA recipients and dreamers is because their parents came to the United States. And why did they come here? Because they knew that they could get a job in the United States. We have to take away that ability to eliminate future illegal immigration, or regardless of how we handle the current situation, we're going to be having the same discussion 10, 15, 20 years down the line, because a new crop of foreign citizens will enter the United States illegally and find ways to work here. So the best way to end future illegal immigration and prevent us from having these kinds of debates in the future is to require employers to use E-Verify, which would require them to ensure that their
full
new hires are
employment and a
to
thriving economy. Isn't that because of the fact that you have this very dynamic workforce?
We do. The economy is doing well, and the unemployment rate has certainly come down from where it was, up around double digits just a few years ago. But there's still some vulnerable Americans. If you look at the unemployment rates for Americans with a high school degree or less, and these are working-aged Americans between the ages of 18 and 65, they're still struggling. Their unemployment rates are above average, above the national rate, and they're struggling the most. And through some of these immigration programs that we've discussed here today, we're bringing in mostly lower-skilled workers because we're not considering their skills. We're considering whether or not they have family ties to somebody who's already in the United States, or whether or not they were able they were just lucky and won the visa lottery and able to get a green card to the United States. So they're the ones who are competing with the lower skilled American workers, and as I said, those workers are the ones that they haven't seen a pay increase in 10 to 20 years. Their wages are stagnant. They face higher levels of unemployment.
We have to take a quick break. When we come back, I'll turn to Josh Kraushaar and see if how much of this has to do, in fact, with electoral politics. Stay with us.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.
You Are Here, your programme spotlighting French heritage.
Versailles, the Louvre, Mont Saint-Michel are well-known stars of French heritage. But French genius and France harbours many other hidden treasures. The arts, gastronomy, architecture, as well as nature's wonders. Come along with France 24, discover France's living heritage. From young apprentices to accomplished craftsmen and farmers, to Michelin star sporting chefs. Meet these people whose passion for their professions preserve and drive French heritage.
You Are Here on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Yemen's prime minister and a good part of his cabinet holed up in the presidential palace in Aden as southern separatists take complete control of the country's second city. Clashes rage between Turkish-backed forces and Kurdish militias in Syria's Afrin region. This as Ankara calls the French president's understanding of the situation flawed. Emmanuel Macron warning in a newspaper interview against a cross-border invasion. Macron, who happens to be in Tunisia for a state visit. It comes in the wake of recent anti-austerity protests and calls from Tunisians for debt relief and student visas to come to France. Private television stations remain shut in Kenya as the government arrests the MP who Tuesday administered a mock oath of office to opposition leader Raila Odinga. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at Donald Trump's State of the Union address and his message when it comes to immigration. With us from Washington, Josh Kraushaar, politics editor at the National Journal. Welcome back as well to Chris Chmielewski of the anti-immigration advocacy group Numbers USA. From New Haven, Connecticut, Miranda Yaver, who teaches at Yale University. And here in the studio, Ruth Ben-Artzi, visiting fellow at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Josh Kraushaar, we showed earlier those numbers of who supports building the wall, who doesn't, who supports dreamers and who doesn't, and especially with the border wall issue, it's a very stark Democrat versus Republican divide. Why is that?
Well, it's a very partisan issue with President Trump choosing to elevate immigration as one of his central themes throughout the first year of his presidency. But it's also a very politically polarizing issue. And it's one that has a lot of danger mines for Republicans, because when you look at the polling on immigration, especially in these battlegrounds where the House will be either won or lost by Republicans this November, a lot of these districts, these constituencies, are very suburban, very affluent, and their position on immigration is much more liberal than where the Republican base is, and certainly where the Republican base is on some of these restrictionist measures that were part of this big, broad compromise. And there was a really interesting test case election just this past November in Virginia, a big governor's race where the Republican nominee, who was well-respected, had a good resume, ran on immigration as a central theme. He sounded a lot like Donald Trump did in the State of the Union last night, and he suffered one of the biggest defeats for a Republican gubernatorial candidate in Virginia in many, many years. So there is a real fear, even though they think that the politics in certain ways with a big compromise could play to their advantage, a lot of the individual planks, some of the stuff Chris was talking about, doesn't poll particularly favorably in these swing districts that are going to be up for grabs in this upcoming midterm election. And that's what a lot of Republican operatives, a lot of Republican strategists are concerned about. And they're concerned about the rhetoric coming from the White House.
But other Republicans, Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, saying, well, all these immigrants that are coming in, they're not our voters.
It's not about Hispanic voters. In fact, I mean, that's sort of the big misnomer, that Republicans can win elections without winning the Hispanic vote. But they're losing a lot of the sort of moderate suburban voters because a lot of the base in the party is sounding a very hardline tone on the issue of immigration. Look, I think there are people that would love to see a compromise for border security. They may support a wall that protects the U.S.-Mexico border, and they would love. And then you see the public polls that show widespread support for giving some kind of legal status to these dreamers. But when you talk about reducing legal immigration, when you talk about some of the more polarizing issues that have not usually been in the open in the immigration debate before Trump became president, those are issues that don't poll quite as favorably, and it risks a backlash with these swing suburban voters that have often voted Republican in the past.
Josh, permit me a digression, because reading the Democratic Party's response to the State of the Union was a Kennedy. Your thoughts on that?
Well, he certainly had a little bit of lip gloss that got more attention, I think, from some than the speech itself. What I don't understand is why the Democratic Party is looking for a white guy who's part of a political dynasty who is in Congress because of his last name, but not because of his professional credentials. The Democratic Party is becoming the party of sort of identity politics, where they really are looking for people who are not white males, if you will, to represent them in Congress and in the governorships. So to pick one of their kind of children of a family dynasty in politics to represent them in this big moment, I thought was a little bit tone deaf for the party.
All right, let's listen to him. 37-year-old Massachusetts Congressman Joe Kennedy III had this to say about values and the whole immigration debate.
It would be easy to dismiss this past year as chaos, partisanship, as politics. But it's far, far bigger than that. This administration isn't just targeting the laws that protect us. They're targeting the very idea that we are all worthy of protection. Their record is a rebuke to our highest American ideal, the belief that we are all worthy, that we are all equal, that we all count.
Miranda Yaver, is the United States at a turning point?
I hope so. So one thing I would add to what Josh said earlier, and I'll come back to Kennedy's comments, is that while we can look at partisan divides in public support for various immigration policies, one challenge that we have in 2018 and beyond is a very small number of competitive districts. We have a lot of gerrymandering in the United States, and in addition to obviously creating certain partisan disadvantages, that also means that we have very limited incentives for politicians to be politically responsive to constituents. And so, while we can turn the polls and say, well, 70% support Dreamers, 62% oppose the wall, if we see a lot of legislators who aren't in competitive districts, whose seats aren't necessarily up for grabs, that doesn't necessarily inspire them to leap to support policies just out of political responsiveness if they don't necessarily agree with them. I think that we're seeing a political movement in the United States that we haven't seen in decades. Probably since Vietnam, between women's marches, with activism around DACA, around healthcare. I think that Kennedy was a pretty inspired choice by the Democrats, in that he has been one of a really frequent voice advocating on healthcare. He's really he's been a really strong voice for a lot of the issues that are at the Democrats' core of the Democrats' agenda. Although I agree with Josh, I think that the Democrats probably could have done better in terms of diversity.
But when it comes to what he said about immigration, are U.S. values changing? That's my question.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I think that we're seeing a significant movement at the grassroots level in defense of immigrant rights, but we're also seeing an administration that hasn't been particularly responsive. And I think that if legislation gets advanced that undermines immigrant protections, it could take some time to undo that. Something that we saw in the Obama administration was an expansion of executive branch authority, through executive orders, which was largely in response to an unusually obstructionist Congress. But now we have expanded executive branch authority, and it's in the hands of someone who isn't nearly as sympathetic to civil rights, to immigrant rights. And so we're probably going, I would argue that it's probably going to get better before it gets worse. But I think that with sufficient mobilization and with public opinion going in the direction that it is, I think, in 2021 or so, we could start to see some changes for the better.
Chris Chmielewski, your thoughts on Donald Trump? He's the president of a country that's founded by immigrants. When he makes the remarks that he did before congressmen a few weeks back, talking about, excuse the expression, shithole countries, and saying, why can't people come from places like Norway? Is that a change of tone, a nativist change of tone? Some might even call a racist tone.
Well, I would concede that his rhetoric at all times hasn't exactly been great. We certainly don't. I certainly don't endorse some of the things that he's said, but I think he is bringing a little bit of awareness of how immigration in the United States, what role it's played in our nation's history, and what role it currently plays, and what role it should play in the future. I think I think the country is finally having a discussion about some of these issues that we haven't discussed in a really, really long time. Some of the things that we've already talked about today: chain migration, visa lottery. I couldn't have imagined.
So getting back to what he said, we heard him at the outset of our show talking about Americans are dreamers too. Is that a dog whistle message to say white Americans are dreamers too?
I don't necessarily think it's a dog whistle for white Americans. I think what it is listen. Donald Trump is in the White House because of the forgotten man. Yes. Josh did a really good rundown of what the electoral politics look like in the United States right now. But at the same time, Donald Trump won the election in 2016 and really shocked the world when that happened. And the biggest message that the two biggest things that he was pushing were immigration and trade. And those two issues are somewhat intertwined with each other. The American people collectively didn't reject those messages. And I think, there's a lot of focus right now on these 690,000 DACA recipients, 3 million dreamers that are in the country. There's a ton of focus on them. And I think he just is trying to say, listen, there's also a lot of American citizens who are hurting and struggling. And we need to make sure that we're also helping them achieve their dreams as well, and not, shutting down the government for a few million illegal aliens.
Ruth Ben-Artzi?
I completely disagree with that. I think I think that this is a value. This is a dog whistle to the alt-right, to the extreme right. I think that Donald Trump's success in the Electoral College in the election, not in the popular vote, it should be stressed, was based on this base that is very hardline and very right-wing. I think that it is about white Americans. It is about xenophobia and racism. And I think that what Kennedy correctly said in his rebuttal speech was that it is about values. And this is why we see also middle-class, suburban, upper-middle-class voters that would normally maybe vote for Republicans wary about this immigration debate, because almost everybody has relatives or people they know who were immigrants. They're immigrants. Their great-grandparents were immigrants. Their grandparents were immigrants, or their parents were immigrants. Donald Trump's wife is an immigrant. So this idea that that immigration is somehow tied to jobs has been peddled as a myth for many, many years now. I think that this has been a long time coming, and it's been bubbling. And Donald Trump's election has allowed those who hold these very extreme right views to feel confident that they can speak up. But in fact, jobs are not, or those forgotten Americans, as Chris mentioned before, those low-skilled white workers are not unemployed because of immigration. They're unemployed because the U.S. government is not doing enough for skill training for those folks in the heartland who can't get jobs. It's because the education system in the United States, the public education system in the United States, is underfunded, and that doesn't prepare those young people for the current modern 21st century job market. It's not because of immigrants that they don't have jobs. jobs. So this idea of tying jobs or job loss or joblessness or unemployment of certain classes in the United States, of white Americans, to immigration is completely false, but it's believed by a swath of Americans.
All right. As Chris was rightly pointing out, it's not just about immigration. The past week has seen renewed tension between Trump and Europe on trade, and another arduous round of negotiations on trade with Canada and Mexico have just finished over the makeover of the North American free trade deal. Here's what Donald Trump had to say in his State of the Union address.
America has also finally turned the page on decades of unfair trade deals that sacrificed our prosperity and shipped away our companies, our jobs, and our wealth. Our nation has lost its wealth, but we're getting it back so fast. The era of economic surrender is totally over. From now on, we expect trading relationships to be fair and, very importantly, reciprocal.
Josh Kraushaar, let me ask you, because here in Europe, we've had the Brexit vote, where it's drawbridge up for the UK. Listening to the remarks there of Donald Trump, how isolationist is the United States right now?
I think one thing you have to consider when you listen to President Trump's rhetoric is oftentimes his bark doesn't always match his administration's bite. And a lot of the policies coming out of this administration in the first year don't necessarily match up with the campaign rhetoric and even the rhetoric in the State of the Union that we heard last night. Look, this administration is more populist on trade, is more protectionist on trade than other Republican administrations in the past. But one of the central arguments Trump made on the campaign was he was going to rip up NAFTA, and that frightened a lot of our North American allies. And it turns out that there hasn't been a whole lot done on that front. The big move on trade that the Trump administration has moved on is pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but that was something that even Clinton was opposed to in the presidential campaign. So there was actually a bipartisan opposition on that front, both in Congress and on the presidential campaign trail. So you're going to hear rhetoric on trade that we've heard, certainly a lot of this tone on trade that sounds a lot different than what we've heard from past presidents. But in terms of policies, in terms of ripping up trade deals, I think you'll hear a lot of tough talk. But when it comes to an actual policy, it's going to be much closer to pragmatism on that front.
All right, Ruth Ben-Artzi shaking her head. Why is that?
So I agree that I don't think that he's going to do anything about NAFTA. And I think that the interesting conversation to have about NAFTA that few people remember is that NAFTA was actually Reagan's idea. This started in the 1980s, and Reagan was not able to pass it. The idea for a North America free trade agreement came out of an immigration or undocumented immigrants problem. And the idea
right,
was
but that was then, this is now.
This is now. But that was negotiated by Republicans. It was something that Republicans could hold dear to their heart. So Trump's ability to change any of that with Republican support is non-existent. And it is, I agree with Josh that this is completely rhetoric, just rhetoric that is not going to materialize. I do think that trade is tied to immigration in very meaningful ways, especially when it comes to Central America and the United States relationship with countries, not just with Mexico, but with other Central American countries. And this also brings up a value debate of where is the responsibility of the United States, where we have multinational corporations and we have an economic outreach, sometimes economic power that puts people out of work. Do we have some sort of a responsibility to also increase or to strengthen our trade relations as part of a larger hemispheric policy that also touches on issues of security? It also touches on issues of economic growth. This is multifaceted, and it's connected both to free trade and to immigration. We can't separate those two. And I agree with a previous speaker a few segments ago who said that the job loss is more significant to outsourcing and to using the cheap labor elsewhere rather than to immigration coming to the United States and taking those jobs.
Miranzi Yaver, are we focusing too much on economics in all of this? Is this more about identity than it is about the pocketbook?
I would argue that it is. I'm not a trade expert, but I've seen analyses of NAFTA, and some of them show that it had a modest positive effect. Some have shown that it had a modest negative effect. Some have had sort of a null effect. And that leads to me just, so wherever you come down on NAFTA, I don't know that Trump's assessment that it was the worst trade deal in American history is necessarily on point. And I agree with previous, statements that, that he's more talk than he is action. I think that a lot of the concerns about immigration, about race, tend to be less data-driven and more concerned about racism, xenophobia, just general. I think something that we've done far too much in this administration is conflating a discussion of populism with a discussion of nativism. At the end of the day, this president has not been at all populist. He is, a millionaire, billionaire. He has supported a tax cut that concentrated wealth at the very top. He has had a cabinet that has come from industry. He isn't really looking out for working men and women, but he is sort of making them feel heard by saying that he's going to bring their jobs back when they are really going overseas. They're not going to people who are coming from Mexico. I think that one of the other important areas where we're seeing a disconnect between the rhetoric and the data is the relationship between immigrants and immigration and crime. We saw in the State of the Union that the president was talking about MS-13 gangs and talking about immigration as though immigrants are coming in and just bringing crime. We saw the president in the campaign trail talk about when people send us the immigrants, they're not sending their best, they're sending rapists. And but in reality, data show that immigrants are less likely to be incarcerated, with both legal and illegal immigrants. They're less likely to be committing violent crime. And so it seems that a lot of this is much less driven by actual economics or crime, and that sort of data-driven empirics.
Data-driven empirics
based on.
We're out of time.
I think
Chris Chmielewski, we're out of time. Just in one word, your prediction: will NAFTA be? Will it be revamped or ripped up? And will there be a deal on immigration in 2018?
I'm not a trade expert like Miranda too. I think it'll probably be renegotiated. I don't think it'll be ripped up. I think we'll get something on DACA. I'm just not exactly sure what that final deal will look like. But I think something's going to happen.
All right, we'll be covering that something here on France 24. I want to thank you, Chris Chmielewski, for joining us from Washington, Miranda Yaver in New Haven, Josh Kraushaar in the U.S. Capitol, and Ruth Ben-Artzi. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.